Today, we are looking at international student enrollment, which I am super excited about. This was the most requested topic by you. So here we are, bringing us all together. And as a lot of you probably know, over the past 5 years, the Canadian international student landscape has seen just a few changes here and there. Um, and there's been some really interesting highs and some really interesting lows during those changes, from record growth to massive decline in a very short amount of time. We're seeing a lot of tighter policies. A lot of institutions are facing what is really a fundamental reset in their international student enrollment. So when we asked people what they wanted to hear about most this fall, a lot of it came down to what are institutions doing to adapt to international student policy changes? What does sustainable recruitment actually look like? How does Canada rebuild trust and integrity around their international student program overall? And to help us unpack those, we have two lovely folks joining me today. We have Victor Tomiczek, who is the Director of International Recruitment and Global Partnerships at Cape Breton University, which is the university in my hometown, near and dear. But also an institution that has kind of become one of the first Canadian universities to really go kind of big and double down on international students. Also, we have Eric Simard, who's the director of Fanshaw International and the former director of International Recruitment and Market Development at Fanshaw College. And as you all know, Ontario's colleges have been at a lot of the forefront of the conversation on international student policies. So together, we will have about a half-hour conversation about what has been going on in the international enrollment world. And then we'll open it up to you to ask questions and share your experiences. And we invite you to do that primarily by unmuting and giving us a little talk. But you can also use the chat. But we're here to foster conversation, make some friends, meet new people. So I really do encourage you to hang out and chat with us. And if that's all good, I think we're probably ready to hop in. Eric, Victor, are you ready?
All set.
Fantastic. All right, my first question is actually to the both of you. Canada's international enrollment has shifted dramatically over the past 5 years. Like I said, with record growth to pretty massive policy caps. How would you describe the mood around international recruiters right now? Are institutions, optimistic at all? And I think we'll start with Eric.
Oh, I get to go first. Well, thanks for having me. I would say if you're asking me about the mood with recruiters, I think recruiters think in the short term. They're always worried about the next intake. There may be two intakes in advance. And so I'd say, they're worried, they're concerned. They're looking at those numbers being lower than history or in our past processes. But I think as leaders in the institution, we have to think beyond that point, right? What's this going to look like in 2 years or in 3 years, 4 years, and where do we want to be as an institution? So I think we need to be more optimistic when we look at longer timelines, and I think that's the right approach for those timelines.
Victor.
Yeah, I would be lying if I didn't say like our colleagues at home and abroad are fearful in the short term, similar to what Eric kind of said. Because everyone is in Canada, colleges, universities, partners, service providers are likely facing large budget cuts, shortfalls. But CBU is optimistic in that we were planning for a reduction in international student numbers anyway, albeit not so dramatic nor abrupt. So the shock has been a bit much to work through, but we're really focusing on new programming that serves our community and focusing on continue to welcome students from, locally across Canada and around the world.
Absolutely. Victor, I'm going to stay with you on that train of thought for a second because, like I said earlier, CBU was one of the first universities really to kind of, be publicly known for an institution who's really diving into international student recruitment. And I think, as far as I know, and I would be happy to be wrong if anyone has other information, but I think CBU was the only university at least that I knew of that actually did have a plan to reduce the number of international students on their campus. I'd be really curious kind of looking back, how did that scaling up so quickly go, and what lessons did you learn? Opportunities, limitations? How'd it go?
Yeah. Well, it definitely taught us to break down silos within the university and show us that, everything from recruitment, retention to education, service, and care for students is the entire student experience, which is something we really want to make exceptional. And demographic necessity led to intentionally scaling up international students. For Cape Breton had, 40 years of population decline that we wanted to address through attracting, retaining international students and their families in our island, but also after COVID, and we learned, sometimes the East Coast accommodation offer letters that have, 4 intakes, and then an unanticipated spike in study permit acceptances kind of drove our SEM planning a little off from what we had planned. So we basically welcomed 2 years of students in 1 year. But it really did teach us just how connected to the community the university is as well. And we, invested in community service like transportation and buying buses for the community, the amount of small businesses created, and the teachers that were needed for schools. I mean, it's a net benefit for the community and for the university at large.
Absolutely. I was home a few weeks ago and I was saying to someone that, it's really interesting having grown up in North Sydney, but in the Sydney area, that there's so much difference in Cape Breton in particular over the past 5 years in like a really pleasant way. And so it's always interesting to go home and see those changes. Eric, I'm going to jump over to you. So the colleges, particularly in Ontario, have been at the center of a lot of the IRCC commentary about recent policy changes.
Mhm.
What have the immediate impacts been on recruitment pipelines and partnerships for you folks? And how are colleges adapting to the new permit and attestation rules?
Yeah, thanks. I would say, the adaptation piece has been, well, I mean, I think we're doing well in terms of that process and trying to figure out how to maintain current levels or increase from where we're at. Um, it's a tricky conversation because if we talk about 6 months ago versus yesterday, I mean, the answers are slightly different. So adapting to the attestation letters and to the cap rules, I would say we did very, very well at that. We were pretty quick to launch that because we work with our own application portal provider, and so we weren't joined at the hip with all of the other Ontario colleges. So for us, we pivoted quite quickly and were able to adapt to that. In terms of the cap, I think at this point, because of the constant change over the last 18 months, I would say that it's decreased demand so drastically that the cap becomes kind of irrelevant. And so the number of PALs for Ontario colleges, we all wish we had more. But at this point, frankly, there's lots of reason to believe that we probably we're not going to use them all, or there's risk that we might not use them all before the end of the year. I know that's a very different story for the private providers and my colleagues on the call who are from those institutions. And for universities, I know that they've struggled in different ways. When you say we're at the forefront of these kind of policy announcements, I think that it's easy to look at Ontario and say, wow, they really got big really fast. And I think we did. But grouping us all into one type of institution is kind of hard. And it's tough for us as an organization. The organization I work for really took an interesting, or what I believe, an ethical approach to that growth, in that we really did limit countries to not become predominant within our institution. And so, India being a huge, sender of students to Canada, we left them at less than 25% of our total student population, right? And we never really exceeded the 50% mark. Sometimes 51% was international, but overall, domestic students still became, were the priority at our institution. But we recruited from over 140 countries and had students on campus from over 140 countries at one point. And so again, that diversity and that diverse experience that we really emphasized across our institution it really affected us in a positive way, and it's left us in a pretty good position now that things are slower, right? We still are attracting students from some of those regions where other schools are just getting going, starting to put recruiters on the ground in some of those areas. We've got 24 recruiters globally who are based outside of Canada. And again, that's doing the good work of meeting with the right students, trying to find the good fit for Fanshaw College and for our institution. So, I think we're in a good spot long term.
I have a question that I am going to pose to the two of you that has been one of the biggest questions that people have been asking me this year. Many people ask all the time about what is the link between enrollment, revenue, research, program funding. How have the recent cuts and uncertainty about study permits affected institutional financial planning or hiring of the like at your institution? And Victor, I'm going to start with you.
Um, yeah. Well, we may not be doing so much new hiring at the moment, but kind of, as I mentioned earlier, we're really kind of using this as a opportunity to really focus on providing an exceptional student experience. We're in the midst of like over $250 million campus revitalization campaign, including opening a new medical school on campus. The school is there. Construction on the building is nearly complete. We've opened a new Nancy Dingwall Health and Counseling Center for students, which also has a 10,000 person newcomer care clinic to serve the primary health needs of newcomers to Cape Breton. We did over $1 million renovation on our campus to provide a accessible shared kitchen space for students that want to cook their own foods in the shared dorms. We announced a new early childhood daycare center, and they're tripling our seats there. And we renovated our Kehoe ice hockey rink with a new gym, walking track, and it's the home for women's hockey in Canada. And we're now in the midst of, we broke ground on the Center for Discovery and Innovation that will house, state-of-the-art labs for nursing, engineering, technology, public health, health sciences. So we're really investing in solidifying CBU, hopefully, as a real pillar of the community, because we need to continue to welcome students here. I mean, just in, Cape Breton's median age is like 10 years older than Canada, which in itself is like 40 years old. People just aren't having enough babies to replace the, generation that's going, a massive generation that's going to retire. And we need to ensure that we bring the talent in here to serve our communities, and especially, these rural universities like Cape Breton and many, many of my colleagues across the country. The international student program isn't a separate function. It needs to serve the entirety of the nation. And we all have, we're a federation, and federations have different needs in different places. So we continue to follow that path.
Same question to you, Eric. How have some of these changes and cuts really impacted what's been going on at Fanshaw and maybe a more general reflection on what's been happening in the college sector?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Victor more around, the need for local, influence on some of these changes. It's a really great comment, Victor, in terms of the need for growth of our economy is going to be tied directly to immigration, tied to, what a great way to do it is to tied to people coming here wanting to learn, gain skills, and then go into our workforce. It's why we do what we do, and I think many on the call would agree with that statement. We're passionate about this work because we see that journey, and we see that journey ultimately benefiting our economy and our communities. And the diverse community in my son's school is a good testament to that. Families have come over the last 10 years, brought their children, and what a great opportunity for, my Caucasian son, for him to gain that cultural experience through the immigration pathways that the schools have provided as part of the overall immigration system. In terms of the changes at the institutions, I mean, we know that Ontario has shed, somewhere near 10,000 jobs in higher ed. And so, that's traumatic for all institutions involved. It's quite substantive, Fanshaw, among all of the other schools, are going through that at this time. It's tough on our teams, it's tough on our leaders, it's tough on the people who are being reduced. We can't put, good color on that. It's not going to be it's not pretty. It's tough. It's really tough work. And for those left in the institution, there's more to do with less people to do it. Trying to figure out and navigate that new equilibrium of what does this thing look like for the next 2 to 3 to 5 years in the current context and what the changing context. So, I think it's important to acknowledge that difficulty and those challenges. I think the institutions are all doing so in different ways, right? A lot of consistency across that, but each institution has its own culture and its own values as it relates to how they're going to make those changes. And I think, we're doing great things and we're also failing at certain things, not just Fanshaw, but us as a sector. And so we'll learn from those things over time. I think if we look to the UK and Australia who've been through this in the past, right? They've gone through these kind of study permit announcements and changes historically. They've seen drops in their institutions and right sizing. 3 to 5 years, things bounce back to bigger and stronger than ever. And so, again, if we look at that long-term horizon, I think there's reason to be optimistic about the sector, about our work. And I think we can continue to be proud of the work that we're doing until that point and beyond.
Fantastic. Yeah, I tell people all of the time that when we look at international comparisons, the UK is about 24 months ahead of us, and Australia is somewhere in that near ballpark too. And watching kind of how that plays out there is always an interesting indicator of what might play out here. So when people register for this session, one of the things that you're prompted to do is give us what you want to talk about in this particular session and what you want to hear in future sessions. So some of the things that we heard in coming into the session was a lot of concern about changing the composition of campuses, regionally concentrated international populations, shifting source countries, as mentioned earlier, and then, of course, things like pressure on housing and services. Victor, I'd be curious, how has your institution, particularly situated in a relatively small, I'm going to call it a small town, now sitting in Toronto, but, Nova Scotia's biggest city, beside Halifax. So, how has your institution been managing kind of the challenge and balance between growth and diversity and community integration? What does that look like on the ground?
Yeah. All right. I mean, this is just to put Nova Scotia into context that Sydney is our second biggest city after Halifax, like 80,000, 85,000 people. So I mean, it's like we're more of a rural place. And I mean, the welcoming and retaining international students and their families in Cape Breton has had a generational impact on the island. I mean, and that's not hyperbole. We are reversing decades-long outmigration, the first population increase in over 40 years in 2019. There's definitely, I would prefer to have problems associated with growth and problems associated with decline. And, of course, there were strains on services, housing, and investments to mitigate those strains. And I'll just kind of note that the residences on CBU were never at capacity throughout the entirety of the growth of the international student program. And now the reverse impact is hitting the island or the municipality, whereas the local transit system is now facing like a $275,000 revenue loss in anticipation of the lack of usage. Our local K-12 schools are now facing another decline in enrollment. It's the impacts are that fast, from needing teachers to now having spaces. And I mean, Eric, like you said earlier, mentioning your son, like when I would assume Tiffany, like myself, like when we grew up in Cape Breton, everyone in our class basically looked like us. But my daughter has friends in her school whose folks moved here from India, from Nigeria, from Philippines, from China. And like, that's what makes me proud of the work we do here. We're like having a real fundamental positive impact on the communities. And we invest in that. Like we have we're an international tourist destination at Cape Breton. I welcome everyone to come, especially in this time of the year. If you haven't visited before, it's beautiful. But all these smaller, tourist communities and villages around the island don't have enough workers to sustain the their sector. So we've invested in the community engagement program, buying vans that drive students to Cheticamp, to Inverness, to Mabou, to Marguerite, to work these jobs all around the island, because we're like Cape Breton University, but like we're Cape Breton's university, right? We have a responsibility to our island and our present and future growth.
I will echo that call that right now is probably the best time, in my opinion, to be in Cape Breton. Celtic Colors Music Festival, the actual trees itself, pretty little time if you've never been. Eric, one of the things that several of our participants were also interested in, and we did touch on it a little bit last week when I had a handful of students on, how can institutions better support international students beyond just recruitment pipelines? What practices, orientation, advising, community partnerships have worked well or maybe not worked so well in helping students be able to succeed after they arrive on campus?
Well, you named a bunch. I would say all of them, right? All of these things that we've built over the years as institutions have helped. They may not have helped every student, but giving those students the choice of what they are going to participate in and what we know they'll benefit from, I think has been the real strength of our institutions. We've put those services in place over the years, things like pre-departure orientations in person, right? So in Kenya, we do in Nairobi, we do an orientation for that group of students before they get on the plane coming in January. And we tell them what it's going to be like and what they should wear and where they're going to get their cell phone SIM card and all of that important stuff that we take for granted by living here all day, every day. Um, when I think about those practices, I mean, they're all super important. They really are. And so how do we maintain those with declining enrollment? We're going to do less of them, but again, the diverse offer is what's, I think, most important there.
One of our guests last week, Alami, who's from Ontario Student Voices, said something really interesting the last time we all met, which was basically you can give students the tools to build community, but you can't necessarily force community on them. And so being able to provide those options, of course, will continue to be important. And as I'm sure we all know, are having hard discussions right now at every single one of our financial tables.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Tiffany,
please.
I think too, like I think this is one of those points where the federal government's maybe misinformed, right? They've been pretty critical about some of the services they assume we're not providing. I don't know if they just don't know, but the understanding about what it's going to cost in the institution has been a constant. That's constant language from the federal government. And I think I don't know of one institution that doesn't try and articulate that on their website, on their emails that they send to students. I don't know any institution that's not already doing those kinds of minimum things. So I think there's the disconnect between what's actually happening in these institutions and what the government thinks should be happening because they've read it somewhere. Again, I'm not entirely sure where they're getting that information, but it's not from the schools. I wish they would just ask.
Well, on that topic, let me stay with you for a minute here, because given recent headlines and, all of the IRCC interventions to the problems that they deem are occurring on your campuses, how do you think the sector should react to that? Or how do you think the sector should rebuild trust with the government, with communities, with students around not only the integrity of international education in Canada, but really about the autonomy of institutions to kind of navigate uh, their students' experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about engagement. I think it's about connecting with the government bodies, but also our communities. I think there's a ton of work we need to do with our communities to help them understand what we do with our international students in terms of supports and how we help them. And I think there's a misconception around what value they add to our communities versus what draw they add on our services. That is just part of that global policy cycle for the federal government. They're trying to understand this thing. They're enacting policies that even their own representatives, IRCC officials, are having a hard time keeping up with. We all see those violations, those disconnects between one IRCC expert and another. They're not always as informed and up to speed because of the speed at which these changes are happening. So I think it's about connection. It's about engaging with the community, with experts in the industry to understand I don't think anybody on the call has concerns with government enacting policy to make the system better, to make it stronger, to make it a better, more consistent experience for our students. I think we're all on board with that. Aligning programs for the colleges anyways, aligning them to the labor market. It's kind of exactly what colleges were designed to do in the first place, was teach the skills for the jobs of the future. The challenge with the current policy enactment is that they're looking in the rearview mirror at the data from past years to decide where those gaps are. They're not looking at things like cloud computing, which is not a program that's on their approved list, but that's the future of technology. They're not looking at what's coming in the Canadian economy, and the schools can provide some of that because of how closely we're tied to the labor market. So again, I think it's about engagement. I think it's about connection. And I think that's the work that we're going to continue to do over the next 16 months.
Victor, same question to you.
Yeah, and don't want to repeat everything Eric said verbatim, like, because I agree with everything that you said, Eric, of course. And like, we need to and are working much closer, with the province, with our non-government bodies and the region to try to align our programming to serve the needs of the, Atlantic, Cape Breton, even region with our graduates to retain them in our community. And I think IRCC needs to recognize that we do need the regional approach to the international student program and to serve places that, immigration is not a bad word in terms of retaining your international students. I mean, it's only logical to think that the best newcomer could be someone who's young, motivated, entrepreneurial, wants to contribute to their community and have a Canadian education with it. And those, like Eric said, we of course welcome, and there is needed changes to the international student program, and maybe could have taken more of a surgical approach than like a blowtorch, but we're dealing, of course, with the aftermath and the outcome. And I mean, people like or like a lot of fingers point at Ontario, Vancouver, or whatever, but it's not the fault of our great institutions like Fanshaw. It's like the nature of being in or around the Greater Toronto area or Vancouver. You think of England, you think of London, right? You think of India, you think of Delhi, you think of Canada. You don't necessarily think of Cape Breton Island and Nova Scotia on the East Coast, right? So I just think there's a need to just acknowledge the overcorrection that IRCC made and just work with the institutions and bodies like CBIE and others to go forward together that would benefit us all in our communities.
That leads so well into my next question for you. Let's say you were put in the chair and can control the things, how would you design what Canada's international student program would look like by 2030? What would be a priority for you, and what would you correct?
Is it me first on this one?
Yeah, you first. Let's stick with you. Easy question, so.
I mean, like I think you mentioned earlier, like, the Australia or the UK or whatever, sometimes we look to where we're going to go as Canada, like maybe more responsibility should be put on the regions or the provinces or the DLIs themselves with regard to approving or allotting study permits to fit the region, to share the responsibility with the institutions, to provide us the trust to bring in the right students, the correct student. And of course, I just want to repeat, like, recognize everyone in a country as vast as Canada, they have different needs in different regions, and just a blanket federal policy is not going to cover those labor market needs, like Eric said earlier, that are different everywhere. An island like Cape Breton, supply chain is always going to be incredibly important, right? Healthcare is incredibly important to everybody, right? There's just so many opportunities to take more of a surgical approach instead of painting everyone with the same brush, and work with the institutions to make it the way it should be.
Eric, same question over to you.
Thanks. I mean, when you ask if there's what about Canada's international education strategy, I'd like them to create one as a starting point. Uh, Sorry, I'm being a little cheeky there, but as we know, education's provincial, and so feds have, used immigration as a way to involve themselves. I think they should definitely engage with the provinces and build this with all involved. And again, that's through consultation and collaboration and leveraging the expertise. But yeah, the not identifying the local needs of each of the provinces is a huge gap. And Victor, you're absolutely right. I hear you about supply chain. That's a really good example. For us, we're, local, South London, Ontario, we're building a great big battery plant for Volkswagen, and green vehicle technology is not on the approved list. So, for us to train the future workforce for that great big new investment in Canada, we're going to struggle to find the students to fill those programs. And so again, local needs, regional needs, provincial needs are super important, but let's start with that strategy. Let's start with a larger plan and a larger conversation of how to make Canada competitive against those other global attractors of students. But yeah, I think let's start by building one. That'd be my answer.
Let me just say I'd love to see it. And I admit that I have probably less hope than most people that we will, but hopefully we can all work together to continue to build something good.